Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Welcome to day 19 of teaser season for patch 3.25 and the upcoming Settlers of Kalguur expansion, which is going to be hitting in not much more than 2 days time. Today, we're going to be talking about a bunch of things, but there is one thing we're going to be skipping over, and that's because it got its own video, and that's everything on the new and changed gems information. I did a deep dive into all of the new gems. I'll put a link to that up at the end of this video, but it's its own thing. It's half an hour long and it's a deep dive into all of the new gems in this expansion. Worth checking out, but let's jump over that and jump to the private leagues announcement. Now this is an announcement Grinding Games make every league, and I hate the way they announce this because to a casual glance, this first looks like it's going to set off your pay to cheat alarms. This looks like it's a way to pay money in order to get into the new expansion quicker. This announcement is far less significant than this. All this announcement means is that if you are intending to run a private league for league start in 3.25, then all of the administrative back-end work of making that league happen, you're allowed to start doing that now. You're allowed to configure the league, start igniting people, start crowdfunding for the cost of it, and all of those other administrative things, but this is nothing to do with your capacity to actually start playing the game. So keep that in mind. I really dislike the way that they announce this. It's something that comes up every league, and I'll probably whinge about it every single league. That's all that this announcement means. Next up, there are some changes to the patch notes. Firstly, Earthshatter Fragility is getting a bug fix that is going to be fairly impactful to it. Secondly, Rampage and item swapping. This is something related to everything we discussed about with the Dancing Dervish yesterday. Basically, all sorts of item swapping with Rampage is no longer going to work. You will no longer be able to benefit from a Rampage kill streak if you have a Rampage item equipped to start it, and then you remove that item and replace it with something better once the kill streak is started. Honestly, I prefer this. This is one of those forms of min-maxing that wasn't fun to engage in. It did work, but it was just anti-fun. One of the things Grinding Games seem to be going really hard in on this league, if there's a way that you can min-max your character that is not fun to engage with, they're crushing those ways of min-maxing your character so that they no longer feel like they're mandatory. Isn't that right, Ancestral War Chief, Ancestral Protector? You are mandatory to use, you are not fun to use, so out the door you go. And next we have the Profane Ground nerf. Profane Ground is looking quite a lot worse in patch 3.25 as a result of changes that are being made in order to make Fungal Ground worthwhile considering. Fungal Ground is something you're only likely to get with a triple prismatic oil anoint. The changes that are happening to Profane Ground are pretty significant. Hits against enemies that are on Profane Ground will still continue to have 100% increased critical strike chance, but they're being nerfed from -10 to all resistances to curses have 10% increased effects on them. This is going to make the duel from Uber Cortex meaningfully worse, and I'm wondering if there's going to be any changes to Uber Cortex. Cough cough, maybe bring back the 3 implicit synthesis items that used to drop from Uber Cortex. Otherwise, Uber Cortex is going to be in a pretty bad place going forward into 3.25. Double Strike of Impaling and Cyclone of Tumult are not gaining as much out of the patch notes as was originally indicated when the patch notes were originally put out. And there's a very important clarification to the Kaom's Primacy unique axe, which is going to do the same thing that was always intended, but it's going to get reminder text that's going to make clearer that it is getting more of an upgrade than it might look like on a first reading. Next, there's a couple of additions to the recently asked questions. Now, I want to add something here that I have asked Grinding Games because I think this is really important. I think there is a really common misconception with 3.25 a lot of people have. A lot of people have contacted me saying that I should take into account that the new Recombinators will allow me to get the Grasping Mail exclusive mod. Your character's global armor is increased by the amount of overcapped fire resistance that you have. Normally this is only found on Grasping Mails. They've said that this is going to be something you can transfer on to the new item level 84 exclusive armor pieces using the new spiritual successor to Recombinators. The thing is, I don't know you can do this, and Grinding Games haven't clarified one way or the other. I'd really like to get some clarification because Recombinators did allow you to strip off particular mods from a Grasping Mail and transfer them onto other bases. But there's no guarantee that the spiritual successor of Recombinators that exists in 3.25 will allow you to do the same thing. The same thing applies for building up items that have multiple fractured mods on them. The same thing applies for transferring other esoteric modifiers such as incursion modifiers onto other bases. I flat out don't know whether we can do this or not. There's been no information either way from Grinding Games so far, and I've submitted a question to the recently asked questions asking whether this is possible, and also a number of other questions that relate to the way that the Calandra or Reflecting Mist is going to work and the magnitudes of the modifiers that get modified by it. Anyways, let's go through the questions they did answer. Overexertion says it cannot support Vaal skills, but what about Vaal skills that can be exerted, such as Vaal Ground Slam? Vaal Ground Slam is intended to be the only exception to this rule, and it is getting specific text saying that it can be supported by Overexertion, even though Overexertion normally couldn't support it. What about Aura Effect? Does this scale the damage reduction on Flesh and Stone? The answer here is no, but it does scale the extra damage that you gain when you're in Blood Stance. So if you're in Blood Stance, the extra damage is part of the Aura's ability, Flesh and Stone's Aura ability. If you're in Sand Stance though, the damage reduction that you gain is not part of the Aura's ability. It is a buff that is applied to your character. And so there'll be text clarifying that in game, but that's the way it's going to work. How does Flesh and Stone scale with distance? Enemies within 1.5 meters of you receive the full effect, then it linearly scales down from that to nothing at the edge of the area. Increasing the AO of the aura does not increase the 1.5 meter distance for maximum effect, only what happens to things that are in that intermediate range. Is it intended that the ailment damage penalty previously shown on Eviscerate is no longer present? Yes, it is. Eviscerate is going to be the hardest hitting bleed skill in the game by a country mile, and is really going to do some incredible damage when it's used in conjunction with bleed. Can retaliation skills be exerted? No. This is something a lot of people have been asking about. The reminder text for exertion will now read, Vaal attacks, channeling attacks, retaliation attacks, and attacks which repeat cannot be exerted. Now there is the exception of Vaal Ground Slam that we mentioned before, and there may be the odd other exception, but they'll be mentioned clearly where they come up. What about the Cluster Jewel mod? Added small passive skills grant plus 3% increased attack and cast speed with physical skills. Does this no longer work with a whole bunch of melee skills because they've lost the physical tag? The answer is yes. This mod is going to be much worse in 3.25 than it was in 3.24. And I'm going to say, as someone that does not own any really good cluster jewels that are affected by this, the snark in the response here just made me chuckle. How does Lightning Conduit interact with the multiple shocks from Warden's Oath of Spring? It consumes them all, it removes every single one of them, and it calculates damage based upon their combined magnitude. How do the multiple shocks from Oath of Spring interact with normal shocks that are applied by other players or minions? The shock from the other source will always apply because it's bigger than any of your Oath of Spring shocks. You can then have up to 49 Oath of Spring shocks active on the enemy on top of that. Can tinctures have quality? Yes, and Glassblower's baubles can now apply to tinctures as well as flasks. Tinctures gain 1% more effect per quality. If I have the tincture mastery that causes the first 6 mana burn on me to have no effect, when I reach 7 mana burn, am I losing 1% or 7% of my mana per second? The answer here actually surprised me. I thought the answer was going to be 7%, but I was wrong. The answer is 1%. Can I use items that lower my maximum mana combined with flat mana regeneration to sustain an enormous amount of mana burn stacks? Yes, but within limits. Grinding games have thought of this, and they're not going to let you repeat the Scourge League 0 mana aura stacker builds that they had to emergency patch out during that league. Each stack of mana burn drains a minimum of 1 mana per second, even if your mana is under 100. So if your mana is up to 100, then yes, this strategy works, but if your maximum mana gets lower than 100, it's going to stop giving you any additional benefits. Will auto-exerted Warcries cost mana? Yes, they will. Anyways, that's the entirety of the news for today. I did mention there's a whole other video on the gems. It's probably already on screen, but I'll put a link to it up in the last 20 seconds of this video. Otherwise, that's the end of today's news. I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.